Walker met Carla at a bar. He wasn't looking for what happened, but it happened anyway. Although what he was actually looking for was just not what he finally found. She entered. There was no way to call her a stunning beauty. First of all, she was skinny. The cropped t-shirt she wore was so short that it barely covered her apparently flat chest. It looked as if someone had simply taken a pair of scissors and cut off a piece of fabric. Walker also didn't like the large tattoo on his lower back, just lines radiating from a central design. He couldn't even understand what that was supposed to mean. In the dim lighting of the bar, she looked like her back was just dirty. To top it all off, her hair was wild, brownish in color, quite long, and clearly in need of a good brush. The only truly attractive part was her flat, board-like belly. It was easy to see because she was wearing pink pajama pants tied with a belt that sat so low on her hips that the top triangle of her pubic area was visible. Normally, this look would be sexy as hell, but her toenails were painted bright red, sticking out of her cheap flip-flops and clearly in need of updating. Bright red nails against pink pajama pants completed the look. God. All this did not arouse the slightest interest in Walker, although he did notice how she pulled up her pants. As soon as she let them go, they immediately slid down again. He returned to his beer, about to take another sip. It looks like this evening will be like many others. Drink a couple of bottles, then go back to your crummy second-floor apartment, sleep, wake up, and go back to work. Walker's thoughts wandered to Sherry, his latest crush. A real blonde, delicious, soft where needed. She was fun to be with. She absolutely loved it when he took her down on all fours, her big ass in the air and her luscious breasts swaying back and forth. Sherry was only a couple of years older than himself, and he was barely 22. From the very beginning, it was clear that she was experienced in bed. Walker was not embarrassed by this. He himself already had several novels, mostly one-day or maximum two-night stays. Only one girl, Karen, turned out to be a real problem. She was a virgin. But Walker found out about this too late. Karen turned out to be terribly affectionate and then began to literally follow him on his heels. When Walker decided to break up with her, she turned into a real crazy person. The story with the kitchen knife was the last straw. "You are mine," Karen squealed, waving the blade. How she got into his apartment, Walker never understood. He just touched the switch, and she was already there. The woman he was with at the time screamed, but it was too late. 14 stitches before one big right hook ended it. Walker wasn't one to lay his hands on women. Never, but sometimes circumstances force it. Karen was still in prison that day when he packed his things and disappeared in an unknown direction. Now, several months and several hundred miles later, leaving his past life behind, he met Sherry in this very bar. She ended up in his bed on the very first night. Damn, this woman knew how to have sex. Sherry was much better. She wasn't jealous. Walker did not even try to date other women, although such opportunities occasionally arose. Sherry was too much fun. Everything would have been even better if, 3 months later, she had not suddenly refused him on a Saturday evening, saying that she already had a date. This angered Walker. He thought they were exclusive, but it turned out that he was just a toy for her. The mistake was that he tried to find out who she was dating. That evening, he parked nearby and watched. Some tall guy came to pick her up in a red Corvette. He was wearing a damn expensive suit that looked like it cost more than Walker's monthly rent. He didn't even have a suit, and his car, an old Toyota, started only after much manipulation. Sherry looked more gorgeous than ever. A dark blue short dress, her hair styled in an elegant updo with small curls. The earrings that Walker himself had given her shone in her ears. As the man helped her into the car, her shoulders opened slightly, and for a moment he saw the familiar ample breasts. The guy turned the Corvette right on the road and drove towards the bar, passing Walker's car. Sherry saw him. It was too late to hide. She frowned as she looked at him. Anger, resentment, shame, disappointment, everything was mixed inside. God, now he's become a damn stalker himself. He tried to call her several times, but she did not answer. In the end, he gave up. Now he was sitting at the bar alone, drinking. There were couples around, and at the far end of the counter sat an older woman who was there every time he came. The only free woman was the skinny one in whom he had not the slightest interest. Sighing, he drank the rest of his beer as he prepared to leave. "Hello, big guy," someone's voice was heard nearby. Walker turned and was met with the largest, roundest blue eyes he had ever seen. And then she smiled. It was such a smile that for a moment it seemed as if her face had completely transformed. She even seemed beautiful to him. "Can I sit here?" she asked. Um, of course. He looked around, seeing that half of the bar stools were free. She started asking questions. Walker answered out of politeness. Then he began to ask himself, and she answered. He ordered another beer, and she asked for a glass of wine. They continued their conversation. As it turned out, it was simply impossible not to talk to her. She did not give such an opportunity. "Last order," the bartender shouted. Walker looked at his watch. 2:15 m. God, he sat with Carla for almost 6 hours. Getting up from his chair, he realized that he was drunk and that he desperately needs to go to the toilet. But he managed it. When he left, he half expected that Carla would no longer be there. But she was waiting for him. "Hey, Walker, where are you going?" she asked. "Home. I have to go to work tomorrow at 9, he answered. "Can I sleep on your couch? My brother's house is 20 miles away, and he always tells me off if I get there too late." "I don't have a sofa," Walker told her. "Then a chair? Carpet?" She smiled that slow smile again. "Damn, what blue eyes she has." "Yes, probably. I can get you some blankets or something." Class. The next morning, Walker was awakened by a country song blaring from his alarm clock radio. Some bastard spoke in a nasal voice. He specifically put on this station. He hated this kind of music, and there they played it non-stop. But she woke him up without fail. He began to crawl out of bed, and then his hand came across someone's body. Carla was in his bed. At first he thought they had slept together, but he didn't remember anything from the night before. He remembered how she joyfully exclaimed, "Cool," and took him by the arm, but then nothing. Sitting up, he felt his mouth dry, as if a bucket of contaminated sand had been blow-dried in it all night. He stood up, poured himself a glass of water, and drained it in one gulp. It was only then that he realized that he was still wearing the same clothes as yesterday. He rubbed his forehead, trying to remember. "Can I have one too?" asked Carla. She sat looking at him. She was also wearing the same clothes as last night. Walker quickly brought her water, and she drank half the glass. "I need to shower and go to work," he said. "Okay. Can I take a shower after you?" "Of course," but quickly, he nodded, glancing at his watch. His ex-girlfriend Sherry sometimes showered with him, but it always took at least 45 minutes. Walker went into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Then he realized that his work clothes were in his dresser and shouted to Carla to bring them. She searched for a long time, but finally found his Levi's work shirt and heavy blue jeans. She giggled as he opened the door, a crack to grab some clothes. After he got dressed, Carla went to the shower. She returned 5 minutes later, looking exactly the same as before, only her hair was wet, but neatly combed. "Should I drop you off somewhere?" Walker asked as they walked outside. He looked around for his truck, but didn't see it. "No, I'm fine. Thank you for sheltering me." She rose on her tiptoes and lightly touched his lips with hers. Walker's head began to spin. Her lips were so soft. And then she turned around and ran. He watched as she turned the corner, stopped for a second, waved her hand at him, and she disappeared. "Hey, wait," Walker shouted, but it was already too late. He didn't have her number, her address, nothing. He only knew her name and that she lived with her brother and his wife about 20 miles away. Crap, he thought, but now nothing can be done. He walked a few blocks to the bar, and sure enough, his old truck was parked there. At least he wasn't stupid enough to try to drive the car in the state he was in last night. He fumbled with the ignition, but eventually managed to start the old engine. That same evening, Walker was at the same bar again. Every time the door opened, he looked up, expecting to see her. Finally, around midnight, he gave up and went home. He didn't even understand why he was looking for her, why he hoped that she would appear. She's not his type at all. He loved curvy women with good breasts, elegant, well-groomed, like Sherry. And Carla was a simpleton, if not ugly. Flat as a board, skinny, even her pelvic bones were sticking out. He noticed this because her pajama pants kept slipping down, and she had to tie them tighter again and again. A week later, he abandoned these thoughts. Moreover, one evening Sherry walked into the bar, saw him sitting alone, and immediately plopped down on the next chair. Walker was smart enough not to mention last week, and she didn't say anything either. They found themselves in his bed again, indulging in hot passion. Sherry was on her knees, resting on her elbows, her big, soft, naked ass in the air, and Walker had sex with her properly. He loved the way she moaned and breathed hoarsely while he pounded inside her, trying to last as long as possible. He knew that the rich man in the red Corvette probably also received this body, but Walker intended to prove to Sherry who the real man was. Judging by the way she squealed, he was a lot better than that guy in the vet. "God, I love your body," Sherry purred. Only a week had passed when she told him that she could not go out with him in the evening. She had a date. She was just pulling on her blouse after another hour-long sex. "I need to hurry. He'll pick me up in 2 hours," she said. "Yeah, I guess this asshole is on a Corvette," Walker quipped. "No, I'm going on a date with Jerry from the office. Nothing special. He's just a nice guy who wants to talk." "Of course he wants to talk," Walker snorted. "Damn it, Walker, you don't own me," she said and flew out the door. This time he didn't even follow her. Just reheated one of those nasty TV dinners. The meat was still edible, but how they managed to call this brown slurry mashed potatoes is beyond comprehension. The old woman at the end of the bar waved at him, and he waved back. Well, he survived, since even the bar's regulars began to recognize him. The bartender wordlessly placed a bottle of beer in front of him. Walker sighed. His life was definitely going in the wrong direction. He was already drinking his third and last bottle that evening, thinking about how miserable his life was. He spent the whole day driving this damned forklift in the warehouse, then returning home, eating, and invariably ending up here, on this very bar stool. Sherry gave it to him when it was convenient for her, not for him. "I'm becoming exactly like that damn old woman," he thought, throwing back the bottle to drain it. "Can I sit here?" He heard a voice behind him. He immediately knew it was Carla even before he turned his head. For a moment, he lost his breath. "Certainly," he answered. Carla had her hair carefully combed, and she was wearing a pretty blue blouse with rows of lace down the front. Looking down, he noticed that her skirt, a slightly darker shade of blue, barely reached mid-thigh. The most interesting thing was that it buttoned up the front and left a slit at the bottom, almost exposing her panties when she stood up. Her feet were bare, but she had shoes on. She noticed his gaze and blushed slightly, lowering her eyes for a moment. Then she looked at him again, and that same smile appeared on her face again. "Do I look good?" she asked. "Yeah, you look cute," he smiled as she sat down on the chair next to him. Suddenly, Walker knew he wanted her. He had no idea why Carla was the complete opposite of every woman he'd ever liked. "What?" she finally asked, since he had already been just looking at her for a good half a minute. You are very beautiful today," he squeezed out again. "Thank you. I put myself in order for you, hoping that you would be here. Is it true? For my sake?" "Yes, really." She threw back her head and laughed. It was a clear, ringing sound. Either that, or he was drinking too much again, he decided. "Why did you do this?" he asked. "I've been thinking about you all week. You're the only man I know who didn't start groping me right away. And you're interesting." "Interesting? My whole life is mortal boredom," he grinned. "Why, do you have a girlfriend?" she asked. She was, but... He told her about Sherry, about how she always wanted to date other men. "Great," Carla smiled when he finished. "What's good about this?" he asked, puzzled. "This means that you are free." Walker just stared at her. Can I stay with you today? Before you get too drunk, she giggled and blushed at the same time. Walker looked at her for a few seconds, another surprise. I've really been thinking about you all week, so I decided to come here and see. She smiled widely. Went, he said. Walker was lying on the bed, lazily stretched out, when Carla came out of the bathroom, slowly, as if enjoying the moment. Her movements were relaxed, her gaze confident. She sat down on the edge of the bed, tilting her head playfully and smiling, touching his shoulder. Still, you don't know how to wait at all, she noted with a grin, running her fingers over his hand. Walker just grinned in response, watching her. The atmosphere in the room changed. The air seemed to become thicker from their invisible but tangible attraction. Carla froze and stared at him. What? He asked as she simply remained sitting on her lap, her eyes never leaving his. My God, I don't. I've never seen. You're not a virgin, are you? Walker frowned. Crap. There was no way in hell he would sleep with a virgin again. After last time, he barely got rid of that girl. She literally lived on his doorstep for months. He even had to quit and move. No, it was just one time, and it was. It's so big. Her hand reached out to him. He shuddered from the touch. Then she slid on top of him, pressing her tiny, firm breasts against his chest. They felt like tiny needles piercing the skin. Turning her over, he gently spread her legs. She did not resist. He gently ran his fingers over her skin, trying to get her to relax. When his lips touched hers, Carla trembled. Her breathing became uneven, and her body responded to his touch. He gently ran his palms down, caressing her shoulders and stomach. At that moment, she felt a surge of emotions that covered her head. As Walker approached her, Carla squeezed her eyes shut, her breathing ragged. He froze, allowing her to get used to the sensations. She took a deep breath, then exhaled, feeling their hearts beating in unison. Move, she whispered, and he obeyed. Unexpectedly, it helped. Although every time he came out, he had to fight his way inside again. The second time, an hour later, everything went easier, and the next morning it's even easier. He was late for work that night. This was new to him. He apologized to the boss, who glanced at him and immediately understood everything. He just grinned. Walker fell in love. He didn't have the slightest doubt about this. Carla spent the next week with him, and they never went to a bar. Walker tried to give her a ride a couple of times, but she insisted on running the full 12 miles. When he returned from work, she appeared about 15 minutes later, soaked in sweat. Even in the rain she ran, although this rarely happened in the summer. One day, an unpleasant moment happened. Sherry knocked on the door. Walker hurriedly pulled on his underpants and opened the door. He felt awkward. The moment was clearly inappropriate. Sherry knocked just when he had not yet managed to properly recover. She tried to squeeze inside, but he wouldn't let her. Although Sherry was a big girl and pushed with the same force as him. He had just opened his mouth to say he was busy when Carla called from the bedroom. Who is it, honey? Turning around, he saw her in the bedroom doorway, completely naked. Sherry muttered something ending in asshole and left, slamming the door. But Walker didn't care. It turned out to be one hell of a whirlwind romance. For some reason, Walker just couldn't get enough of Carla. All he wanted was to have sex with her. One evening, he returned home to find Carla already sitting on the porch in front of their apartment building. Walker sat down next to her. He was well aware that something had happened. Carla had never been good at hiding her emotions, and now she was clearly excited about something. I need to ask you one question, she said. Walker nodded, preparing to be thrown. For a moment, he felt an unpleasant tightening inside. Do you love me? Carla asked instead. It was completely unexpected. Yes, he answered without the slightest hesitation. He had never uttered these words before. Carla just looked at him. A familiar smile slowly touched her lips. Carla, I love you more than anything in the world. I want us to be together, he blurted out. God, and I was afraid that maybe you don't love. You never said this, but I so want to be with you. Walker, we are expecting a child. Her eyes suddenly filled with tears. This was another surprise. He looked down at her stomach, but there was no sign there. Wow, is it true? Will I become a father? But we always used a condom, he exclaimed, jumping to his feet and picking her up for a hug. Not the first time, Carla grinned, also jumping, and then, pushing him back, she climbed on top of him. Walker barely managed to unhook it, otherwise they would have done it right there on the porch. Inside, he automatically reached for a pack of condoms, but Carla, noticing this, burst out laughing. "I don't think we need these damn things anymore, honey," she giggled. "God bless," Walker laughed. A month later, Walker and Carla stood before a local judge. The only witnesses were her brother and his wife and Walker's boss. A big wedding would not have pleased him. It was enough for him that Carla now belonged only to him. A little more than 6 months later, little Sarah was born. Walker couldn't believe how 9 pounds, 5 ounces could fit in such a tiny body. He was there during the birth, and it was quite intense. "It's impossible, I can barely go there," he began to say when the sudden appearance of his child's head silenced him. But he managed to say enough to make one of the nurses burst out laughing. And then everyone laughed. Even Carla, despite the tension and sweat, began to laugh, and that was enough. Sarah literally slipped out of there. "We need to hire this guy," one nurse said to the other, after which they spanked the baby on the bottom, and she screamed at the top of her lungs. Little Sarah was born strong and plump, with bright red hair. This was unexpected until Carla remembered that her late grandmother was also red-haired and green-eyed. Walker was over the moon. He and Carla quickly settled into a calm family life. A year later, he received a promotion to shift supervisor, which significantly increased his salary. He expected that they would soon have a second child, but this never happened. But it didn't matter. Sarah took up almost every minute of their lives. When Sarah turned 2, Carla said she wanted to go back to school and complete her education to become a registered nurse. Walker began picking up extra shifts, working a forklift, and putting aside overtime to pay for her education. The boss was not against it. Walker always managed to load huge boxes into freight cars without making holes in them or damaging anything. The next semester, Carla returned to school, running back and forth every day. He understood how difficult it was. Carla didn't drive a car and didn't want to study, but he couldn't give her a lift himself. Either he would have to bring her too early, or he himself would be late for work. There were no buses going there, so he bought her a bicycle. She rode it once, after which she refused to repeat it. Cars scared her. They then moved to a larger apartment just 1.5 miles from the college, and Carla continued to walk there. When her studies came to an end and Carla received her diploma, she got a job with a local doctor. But she only stayed there for a few months. Then she was accepted into a clinic owned by a large national chain. Now she went to work by taxi, but this was no longer a problem because they could afford it. The only drawback of being a nurse is the lack of a standardized schedule. People need medical care when they need it, so Carla often returned home hours late. This did not bother Walker. He had more time to be with Sarah, help her with her studies, and watch her grow from a little girl into a young woman. Meanwhile, Walker rose to the rank of warehouse manager, and their combined income was enough to not deny themselves anything. They bought a cozy 2-room house. Life just got better. They both enjoyed watching Sarah grow up, first in elementary school and then in high school. Walker was at home that evening when the guy first came to their door. He opened the door and saw a young, well-dressed, and polite young man. "Dad," Sarah exclaimed, rolling her eyes indignantly when he warned the guy that she was his daughter, and he must return her home in exactly the same condition in which he took her away. Otherwise, the boy immediately blushed, and Walker just grinned. Sarah hugged him and nodded as he called after them. Exactly at midnight, at 11:45 p.m., Walker heard a car pull up. He sat in the dark living room, then got up and quietly climbed into bed with Carla. "She's home," he said. Carla giggled and hugged him. And then the day came when Sarah, his precious Sarah, left for college on the other side of the country. Walker idolized her. She was the most valuable thing in his life. But now only he and Carla remained. They were not yet 40. At first, it was wonderful. They had more time for love, for walks. The lawn was perfect, without a single weed. Even the white picket fence that Carla dreamed of finally appeared. Sarah called once a week, and Walker looked forward to these calls. Sarah, beautiful Sarah, tall and slender, with her luxurious red hair. She and Carla were his everything. But then Carla became strange. Either she was cheerful and lively, then suddenly she became depressed for a long time. Her mood swings soon began to take their toll on him. There were many quarrels, and they were all over trifles. After one particularly furious one that completely prevented him from watching the races on TV, Walker freaked out and drove to an old bar he once frequented. It had been many years since he had been to this place, but it looked exactly the same. The same photographs hung on the wall, and it seemed to him that he had never left here. One would think that a lot would change in 2 decades, but everything remained the same, as if he were back in his youth. An elderly woman sat at the far end of the bar. Walker knew it couldn't be the same one, but it looked very similar. Now there was a woman standing behind the counter overweight, with an overly exposed cleavage, so revealing that when she bent down to get a bottle from the refrigerator, it became abundantly clear that she wasn't wearing a bra. "What will you drink, honey?" she asked. He ordered a beer, finding that he liked the familiar taste. It had been many years since he last drank it. He was already finishing his 3rd bottle, thinking it was time to go home and see if Carla was cool, when someone sat down on the stool next to him. It took him a second to recognize her, but then he realized it was Sherry. It almost knocked him off his feet. More than 20 years had passed, and she still came here? "Walker, how the hell are you?" she asked. Sherry, "Damn it, you look great," he said. And it was true. She was wearing a loose blouse and a matching short skirt. She even seemed to have dressed up a little, even though it was only 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. He expected to see her gain weight, but that didn't happen. Even the color of her hair remained the same, only it was shorter and styled in a pageboy style. "So are you married? A house full of children?" she asked. "Married, but only one daughter. And you?" "I was married for about 3 months. Now I'm alone again," she said, giving him a meaningful look. "So, no children?" "No, I never met the right man." "Why?" he asked. "When I finally decided who I wanted, it turned out that someone else had already taken him," she answered, smiling slyly and glancing at him from under her eyelashes. Walker nodded, but the meaning of her words did not immediately reach him. "Do you remember the day when I came to you and you were with that girl?" she finally asked after a long pause. "Yes, it was Carla, my wife." "I know. It was just that I had already decided everything. Every guy I dated. My thoughts kept coming back to you. You always made me feel, well, you know." She smiled, her eyes boring into his. Walker felt himself blush slightly. Sherry was really good in bed. They did everything together that they could think of, and maybe even something that would cause surprised looks. He felt his body respond to the memories. He looked straight at her, and she answered him with a sly smile. All those old feelings and memories came to life in him again. He was on the verge of proposing, although somewhere in the back of his mind he knew it was wrong. At that moment, a man of about 50 approached the counter. He said something to Sherry that Walker didn't hear, and she shook her head. "Okay, then can I call you later?" he asked. Sherry nodded and turned back to Walker as the man walked away. "What was that?" he asked. "Just a client," she smiled. "Client?" he asked, slightly puzzled. "A girl needs to live on something, dear. But you know what? If you want, I won't even take money from you. Let's call it reminiscing about the good old days. Besides, with you, I know that I will like it." Sherry smiled widely. "Do you mean, are you working now?" "Damn it, I've always worked, you knew that," she said with a grin. "So that's why you dated?" "No, I didn't know." "It's nothing, Walker. So how about this? Let's have some fun, shall we?" she suggested. "Thanks, but no," he replied, stood up and left. Sherry just shrugged. The last thing he saw as he left was how she headed towards the table of that same elderly man. Carla sat in the kitchen, looking out the window, watching the hummingbirds fight over the feeder. Walker walked over and hugged her. She stood up and hugged him tightly. They made love right there in the kitchen and finished in the living room. A little more, and they would have rolled right out the door if it had not been closed. Every time Carla lifted her hips and Walker pressed into her, they slid forward on a good foot. They started giggling as his head slammed into the front door. It was one of those wonderful moments when the world felt right again. But Carla's mood swings continued, and Walker struggled to remain calm around her. Finally, Carla gave in and started taking medication to get her body back on track. As a nurse, she understood what was happening to her, but as a woman, she resisted it for a long time. When she finally started treatment, her condition improved and she became happy again. About a month passed when Carla returned from work in a strange mood. Walker immediately knew something was wrong, but didn't know what it was. After dinner, she sat down next to him. "I want to ask you something, honey," she said. "Of course, what exactly?" Walker put down the newspaper. "You and I have always been. Just for each other, right?" "Well, yes, of course. And what?" "When we met, I had only a couple of men in my life," she said. "I thought you said there was only one." "But what does it matter?" Carla hesitated for a long time. "I know I said that, but there was this guy in my class even before I met you. We dated a lot. I think I fell in love then." She paused, searching for words. "But then he went to study in another city, and we had to break up. When I met you, I was still dating him sometimes, but this only lasted a few weeks. I didn't know that. Is that why you were so insistent that I not give you a ride to school?" Walker asked. "Yes, I'm sorry, I should have told you, but then I fell in love with you, so he didn't matter," she said. "Why are you telling me this now?" Walker asked. "He came back, started working at the hospital 2 weeks ago. He has day and evening shifts, so I see him every day. He has already asked me out on a date several times. I think I was just afraid that you would find out about it anyway." "Doesn't this guy know you're married?" Walker started to get angry. "Knows." "And what does all this mean?" Walker's voice began to rise. "Don't shout. I thought about it. I want to." "What? Do you want to go on a date with one of your ex-lovers? Are you out of your mind?" "Don't yell at me. I'm just telling you. I never dated. Didn't do much when I was younger, and Johnny makes me feel, I don't know, okay, I guess." She lowered her eyes for a moment, then looked back at him with a determined expression on her face. "Then why the hell should I even talk about this? Why not just go and change it?" Walker jumped up. I I love you. I don't want to destroy us. I can't. I don't want to lie to you. I just want to. I don't know, feel good. Anything new? I liked being with Johnny, and I probably would have. But she met me," he finished for her. "Johnny, huh?" Walker shook his head. "Carla, this is crazy. Are you asking me for permission to cheat?" he screamed. She flinched slightly at his loud voice. "Yes, I think that's exactly what I'm asking of you. It wouldn't affect us at all." Her chin lifted. Walker had seen that stubborn, determined look before. "How the hell could this not affect us?" "Please don't yell at me. It won't affect you, honey. I'll still love you and stay here." "Well, my answer is no," he shouted again. "You don't own me," she replied. Walker looked at her in shock, the same words spoken to Sherry 20 years ago popping up in his head. He turned around, walked out the door, got into the car, and drove away. He didn't know how far he had gone. Where he was going the next moment, he was already approaching an old bar. This place seemed to draw him in whenever he was upset. The old lady was sitting on the far chair at the counter, raised her head, saw him, and waved her hand. Walker approached her and introduced himself. She smiled and shook his hand. "My name is Helen," she said. He nodded, went and sat at the other end of the counter, not understanding why. The same barmaid with a provocative neckline served him a beer. Walker sipped it slowly, his thoughts spinning. 20 long years with Carla, and now she stunned him like this. He couldn't accept this. The fact that she had someone before him, or even dated her around the same time, he could understand. There were no obligations then. But now they are. They are married. They have a child. How could she even think about this? What if she had already done this, and now she was just testing his reaction? How the hell could she even think about such a thing? Walker felt a tear slide down his cheek. He lowered his head and wiped it. Helen stood up, walked over, and sat down next to him. Walker looked at her in surprise. She looked well over 60, just a pleasant old woman. "Boy, either your best friend died or the dog grabbed your leg," she said with a smile. "Problems with my wife," he replied. "Oh, she's cheating?" Helen asked directly. "No, I think not yet. She says she wants to, with some guy she knew a long time ago." "Are you getting along with her?" The old woman spoke so naturally that Walker suddenly began to open up. "Yes, we usually get along, but in recent months she's been kind of nervous, behaving strangely." "Maybe age-related changes," Helen suggested. "Yes, I think it's possible." "It freaks some women out, man. They feel old and unattractive. What is needed here is love and understanding. Sometimes a doctor can help." Hell, she's a nurse, and she's already consulted with a doctor. But why would she suddenly want to go on a date with some old boyfriend? Most likely, she feels that she is losing her attractiveness. When hormones go crazy, anything can happen. Walker didn't know what to say. He just took a sip of his beer. "You know, honey, but you won't solve anything by sitting here," she smiled. Walker understood this. He got up, preparing to go home, but suddenly stopped and looked at the old woman. "Who are you, by the way?" he asked. "I worked in psychiatry for 50 years, man. I can see from a mile away when someone is upset," she laughed. Walker nodded. "Go home, hug her, tell her how beautiful she is. If it doesn't help, come and talk," she said with a smile. "Thank you." Walker nodded and left. He was going to do just that. Walker drove the car at full speed. He ran into the driveway, ran out of the car, and into the house. Carla was not there. At first, he didn't even know where to look. Carla didn't drive, so she either called a taxi or had someone pick her up. "You don't own me," the last words she said to him. There were only 2 taxi services in the city. He called both, but neither received a call from his address. He grabbed his phone and dialed the hospital, pretending he didn't remember the name of the new doctor on staff. "This is Dr. Jonathan Hansen," the receptionist answered. Walker thanked her and hung up. The hospital had an answering machine listing the names and extensions of employees. When the voice said, "Dr. Hansen, extension 1430, he entered the number. A message on the answering machine asked to leave a name and telephone number, saying that Dr. Hansen would be at the conference until 10 p.m. Walker looked at his watch. It was 5 minutes to 9. He got out, got into the car, and drove to the hospital as fast as he dared. Inside, he glanced at the list of rooms in the hall, then headed down the long corridor. Having found the right room, he opened the door and entered. Carla was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee in front of her. She raised her eyes and looked at him in surprise. "Walker, what are you?" Walker looked at the man sitting opposite her. He was tall, attractive, wearing a white coat. Shockingly red hair. Walker felt his chest go cold. He stepped towards the table, rested his hands on it, and leaned forward. They both just looked at him. He saw Dr. Hansen's face change color. Walker understood immediately, at that very moment. It was obvious. Guilt was visible on their faces. "Carla is my wife. If you ever touch her again, I will find you, cut off your arms and legs, and throw you into the river," he told the man in a calm, even voice. He just sat there, his face turning white. "And one more thing. My advice to you is to get out of town, and fast." Then he turned his gaze to Carla. "And you already had sex with that bastard, right? I can see it in your damn face." Carla simply sat there, the expression on her face saying it all. Walker looked back at Jonathan. "I'll call the police. he squeezed out. Call me. It won't change anything. They may detain me, but sooner or later they will release me. And then there will be no place left on this planet where you can sleep peacefully. Then he turned around and walked out the door. He drove home, tears streaming down his face. Sarah, hi Sarah, with the same shocking red hair. 2 decades of love, caring for her, confidence that she was his. And now he knew that, most likely, this was not so. At home, he closed the door and sat down. Somehow, he managed to fall asleep. The next morning, Carla was gone. Walker packed several suitcases, loaded them into the car, and drove to a neighboring town. He left the front door of the house wide open. He rented a motel room, paying a month in advance. He called his work and explained that he had problems and wanted to take a vacation. The boss was indignant, saying that they needed him. I think Carla is cheating on me, Walker said bluntly. Crap. Oh shit. Damn women, their mother. Okay, Walker, do what you have to do. Just don't do anything stupid, okay? I'll look after the office while you're gone. Walker went to the bank and withdrew half of their savings. Then I went to another bank and deposited the check into a new account. Carla earned as much, and sometimes more, than he did, so half was hers by right. She had her own credit cards, so there was no need to do anything about it. Both had separate pension savings, so there were no questions here either. House, it was paid. All that was left was his car, and Carla didn't drive. He had just returned to the motel when the phone rang. Looking at the screen, he saw Carla's name. He pressed a button, raised the receiver to his ear, and was silent. Expensive? Please, come talk to me, she begged. For what? Where the hell were you all last night? I spent the night at Johnny's. What I told you was a mistake. I was completely confused. We didn't do anything, just talked. Johnny's, right? Oh, of course. Tell him I warned you. Now I'm following him. The consequences don't matter. I warned him. The same cold, even intonation sounded in his voice. Darling, please don't touch him. Please don't do this. This will only lead to trouble. I will never again. I promise. Carla burst into tears. Walker hung up. There were 2 police cars parked outside the hospital, but Walker simply drove by. Almost reaching the motel, he noticed that another patrol was catching up with him. A long conversation began. Walker explained that he did nothing, and indeed, apart from threatening the doctor in case he touched Carla again, he did not break the law, so I had to let him go. I understand you, man, but don't, okay? I would rather punch this asshole myself than imprison you. Believe me, we deal with this all the time, and most of the time, it's the good guys who get arrested, the cop told him. Then he got into the car and drove back to the city. Walker returned to his room and went to bed, turned off the phone. The next morning I checked and Carla called more than 20 times. In the afternoon, he was already on a plane flying to New York. Sarah was simply dumbfounded when she saw him enter the lobby of the large brick house where she lived. As always, he noted with admiration how tall and beautiful she was. So different from her mother, who was much shorter. Sarah has matured and blossomed. Dad, she screamed, throwing herself into his arms. Walker couldn't hold back his tears. Where is Mom? She asked, looking around. Carla didn't come. I am alone. I need to talk to you. Walker saw her expression change from surprise to shock as he explained what happened. He did not say that he was sure that Carla had cheated, at least not recently. Mom wouldn't do that, Dad. She wouldn't lie. I'm yours, I know it. You have to talk to her, Dad. Please, she begged. I need to know for sure, otherwise I will never find peace. He took a cotton swab sealed in plastic and a small sample tube from his pocket. Dad, this is stupid. I'm yours, I know it. She also cried. It broke his heart, but he had no choice. She realized this, sighed, and opened her mouth. That evening they went to dinner, where Walker met Sarah's boyfriend. A pleasant young man, well-groomed, on his way to a career as a mechanical engineer. They spent the entire next day together, and in the evening Walker boarded the plane again. He asked Sarah not to tell her mother that he had come and promised to call as soon as he knew the results. But he wasn't entirely sure that she wouldn't tell if Carla called. Once Walker was home and settled, he went back to work. Carla kept calling his cell phone and then started dialing the office number until the secretary warned her to stop. Sometimes Walker answered the phone and spoke to her briefly, sometimes he did not. Without exception, she insisted that she had nothing serious with Jonathan, that it all happened quickly and she didn't even feel anything, and then apologized again and again for even thinking about it. It wasn't enough. Walker simply couldn't find it in himself to forgive her. Have you never looked at another woman and thought about it, Walker? Tell me the damn truth. I know I made a mistake, but I love you. So basically, I didn't do anything. It was nothing. She told him one day when he relented and they had dinner together. No, I don't. Then he hesitated, remembering those few minutes when he met Sherry at the bar. This thought flashed through his mind, but everything changed when he realized that Sherry was now working as a call girl. Probably, on my part, too, there is something to repent of. But I never cheated on you, Carla, not even once. Then he told her about that meeting with Sherry. He knew that for a second he had actually thought about it. But the fact that he slept with Sherry after they met was completely different. Then he and Carla had not yet made any commitment to each other. On the street, Walker opened the car door for Carla. She sat down, made herself comfortable, and then looked at him. Please don't take me home, take me somewhere else. Please, she asked. Walker was reclining on the hotel room bed when Carla emerged from the bathroom. She was completely naked and smiling. Do you love me, Walker? She asked. Yes, I love it. She attacked him, and the long hours that evening were the same as before. He was almost sure that this was also the first time for her in almost 2 months. The next morning, he woke up to her efforts to wake him. Later, as they lay in each other's arms, Carla asked him to come home. Walker knew that was where he really wanted to be. But he still couldn't get Jonathan out of his mind. I don't know. Is this guy still around? Still asking you out? He asked. Johnny? He's still on staff, but he doesn't bother me anymore. We just work together, that's all. Honestly, I think you scared him. I heard that he sent out his resume wherever possible. You won't touch him, please. This will only cause trouble. Walker didn't react when she called him Johnny. Not Jonathan. Not Dr. Hanson. Just Johnny. That's exactly what I was going to do. His voice became hard and cold again. Carla looked at him with concern. I know, but we didn't do anything that mattered. I was confused. Now I'm taking medication. I didn't tell you before, but I'm going through menopause. As a nurse, I understood this, but he just drove me crazy. I love you so much, Walker. She pressed herself against his chest. Okay, let's try it, he said. Carla immediately perked up and was delighted. By evening, Walker had moved back into their home. 2 days later, an envelope arrived. Carla was at work. Walker walked into the living room and sat down. He sat there for a very long time. He didn't want to know, but at the same time, he had to find out. He opened the envelope. The first line read, "The probability of paternity is 0.0%. This is exactly what he expected. Walker didn't read any further. He took the documents to another room and put them through the shredder. He's already found old receipts from Carla's checkbook. It seems that it didn't even occur to her to destroy them. Everything has been preserved and arranged in order over many years. Birth control pills. He never knew she took them. And then he found receipts from her trips to various conferences over the years. The solution was pretty obvious. He then called Sarah in New York. Looks like you were right, honey. You are my daughter, completely mine. He tried to make his voice sound joyful, happy. I knew it, Daddy. I knew this from the very beginning. I'm glad. How are you and Mom? We're fine. She takes medications that help her. Everything will be fine. This is great. I'm glad. By the way, we are flying home in a couple of weeks. We have something to tell you. We? Walker asked. He already guessed what this meant. Wonderful, honey. We both love you very much. I love you too, Daddy. Tell your mom for me. Fine, I'll pass it on. He hung up. He knew that sooner or later Sarah would find out the truth, but he couldn't imagine how she would react to this. So his baby is getting married? It was obvious. Walker was happy for her. This delayed the inevitable a little, but it didn't matter. He went to a local lawyer and drew up a will, leaving all his savings and property in a life annuity with Sarah as his sole heir. Returning home, Walker dialed the hospital number and listened to the menu. Dr. Hansen, extension 1430, said the automated voice. He checked it every day. He hung up silently. He told the man what he was going to do. He thought he had made himself abundantly clear. Johnny was still working there, still spent his days next to Carla. Carla still came home from work late. All these trips, all the conferences, the receipts made this clear enough. Birth control pills, despite the fact that he was trying to have another child, still hoping. Carla did not want to give birth to another man, or she simply didn't want another child at all. The reason no longer mattered. Walker went into the garage and unwrapped the stun gun he had bought. I put it in the case. Walking over to his workbench, he opened the box. It was a really good hatchet, strong handle, perfect weight and length. Made in China. The sticker read. He absent-mindedly tore it off with his fingernail. Everything in this damn world is now made in China, he thought. But the blade is dull. He turned on the sharpener and began working on the edge of the tool. Then he took the whetstone, carefully running it along the edge. He told him absolutely clearly and unambiguously. Perhaps Jonathan will heed the advice. There is still time to escape. Although now it didn't matter anymore. He told him that Carla was his wife. First, Walker needed to get his daughter married. DNA doesn't change the fact that Sarah is his. Well, a month, maybe 2, maybe 6 months. There's no rush. Absolutely none. He told the man what he was going to do. He gave him very good advice. They don't do that. You can't sleep with someone else's wife, whether she wants it or not. Good wives do not lie or cheat on their husbands. One time, one moment, he could understand that the flesh is weak. He knew that he himself was not immune from such a vice. Something like this could perhaps be forgiven and experienced. But years, a lie that lasts for years? Walker tested the sharpness of the hatchet on a piece of paper. It cut easily without tearing the edges. Satisfied, he put the tool into the case with the stun gun and pushed it onto the top shelf. In the house, he saw Carla in the kitchen. "What's for dinner, honey?" He smiled. There's no rush. No rush at all. Walker knew something was wrong the moment his daughter Sarah stepped out of the taxi. How could he have missed the worry in her voice when she called and said she was on her way home? Normally, he would have caught it right away. His wife Carla, as far as he could tell, continued a long relationship with her former lover. This disturbed the peace, destroyed the happy, even peaceful life that they had. Not knowing the whole truth, doubting its denials, his mind raced in torment, although outwardly he maintained a semblance of normality. Like some people, Walker is used to hiding his anxieties inside. And now, looking behind the curtain and seeing Sarah getting out of the car, he realized she was unhappy. A man cannot raise a child from birth until she becomes a beautiful young woman and not feel her condition. From the first moment when a tuft of her fiery red hair appeared between the widely spread legs of his fragile wife, his life became complete. From that moment on, there was no more uncertainty about the future. There were no doubts about tomorrow. This moment became the most powerful in his life. And as often happened to him in stressful moments, he cracked a joke. "This is impossible. I can barely." He blurted it out without thinking. Carla lay with her legs spread wide apart, naked to the waist, surrounded by people. All straightaway understood what he almost said. The whole hall burst into laughter. Even Carla burst out laughing, and at that moment their little Sarah literally slipped out. "We need to hire this guy," one of the elderly nurses quipped, causing an even bigger burst of laughter. When they passed the package into his hands, and he saw her tiny, wrinkled face, the connection became absolute. He would hold her like this forever. But one of the nurses still came up and carefully took the child away, unhooking her tiny hand from his finger. Since then, he always knew what she needed without words. Somehow, they were talking to each other with movements, gestures, and some kind of mental signal. Now, a high, incredibly beautiful young woman, she again evoked in him a wave of pride. Sarah was dressed simply a light green blouse, beige trousers, and a formal vest. And her long, flowing red hair was the same shade which many women try so vainly to achieve. Outwardly, she looked like a conservative young lady. But Walker saw her body, I saw how it spoke. And it spoke clearly she is very upset about something. Overwhelmed with anxiety, he went out onto the porch, even noting with relief that Carla was still at work at the hospital. Carla certainly loved their daughter, that much was clear, but Sarah always went to Walker first, not her mother, when something was bothering her. For some reason, talking to her mother about personal experiences was more difficult for her. Carla even came to terms with this. Sarah had always been reserved with her in such matters. She had no difficulties with Walker. It was always like this, long before she came to him at the age of 11 and said that she was bleeding there. Even Walker was a little surprised, partly because of how easily she discussed it, and partly because she was barely 11. There was no fever, no signs of illness, no particular discomfort, so he understood what was happening. He gently explained everything to her. He had already mentioned it in passing, but he really expected it to happen in another couple of years. He then went after Carla and asked her to show Sarah how to take care of herself. After that, he sat down in his chair, unfolded the newspaper, and began to read with a smile. We're seeing this more and more in the hospital, girls becoming women at an early age, Carla said when he talked to her about it that evening. I wanted her to remain a little girl forever, Walker replied, holding his wife close to him. I know, honey. Believe me too. By the age of 12, Sarah had already developed obvious curves, and she was extremely concerned about this, doing everything possible to hide it. By the age of 13, she had become a simply delightful, and at the same time completely uninhibited young lady. She retained the innate modesty that Walker had always instilled in her, but it was no longer possible to hide what she had become. The transformation happened so quickly that it was almost overwhelming. It seemed like only yesterday that he was removing everything from the house with sharp edges, everything that could harm her, every small object that could fit in her mouth. He carefully cut the curtain cords and tied them high so Sarah couldn't reach them. Anything that could threaten his treasure was changed or removed. And the very next day, he was worried as he watched her ride away on her bicycle, insisting that he remove the side wheels. He did it reluctantly, but she simply smiled, jumped on her bike, and, flying over the curb, sped down the street. Then she got behind the wheel of a car for the first time, and he, sitting by the window, waited for the car to turn the corner and drive up to the house. He carefully made sure that she did not notice him, but it was useless when she entered the house. She simply smiled slyly. Walker carefully explained to his daughter everything about boys, what they want, what their instinct is. He told her that he wanted her to save herself for the one she chose because it was magical. She smiled and promised. Dad was always right. The day he watched her walk down the long corridor to the plane felt like a piece torn from his life. Everything has changed. Carla became more distant and irritable. At first, he thought that she simply missed Sarah, like himself, but then he realized that it was something else. And then the day came when Carla stunned him. Is her ex-lover back in town after more than 20 years? Works with her almost every day, asks her out on dates, knowing that she is married. It was bad enough for a man to pursue a married woman, but an ex-lover. And then she told Walker she wanted to agree. His calm life suddenly turned into pain and suspicion. Embittered that she could even suggest such a thing, he left. The usual composure evaporated in the blink of an eye. Even Carla was surprised by his reaction. Walker moved out. She couldn't even imagine that he was capable of such a thing, no matter what. The last scene in the hospital where she worked was terrible. He said terrible things in a fit of anger. Even her assurances that nothing would happen did not reassure him. He was almost sure that something had already happened, and for quite a long time. But eventually they sat down and talked. He gave up and returned home, but the world was never the same. Words once spoken remain forever. Sarah paid the fare, got out of the car, and looked up to see Walker. She rushed along the concrete path, hugged him, and immediately burst into tears. He put his arm around her waist, led her into the house, and sat her down on the sofa. It took several minutes before she could speak. I caught him cheating. She finally squeezed out and burst into tears again. God, I'm so sorry, honey. He pressed her to him. I loved him. I was going to marry him. And he slept with this Marilyn from the next apartment. I caught them. The words fell from her lips between sobs. It's better to find out the truth now than too late, honey, Walker said, involuntarily remembering his own problems with Carla. He wanted to be with me, but I wanted to wait, get married, as you always said that this was important. Maybe if then he would. Her voice became quieter. No, better wait, honey. Sex is important, but if a man really loves you, he will wait too. If he could go to someone else so easily, then he would have done it anyway. But I did it for him, Dad. You understand? With your hands. Why wasn't this enough? She looked at him directly. Walker didn't want to know. Some men just can't be faithful, my dear. These are not your choice. You're probably right, Dad, but I'm probably the only 22-year-old virgin in the entire college. More likely, he laughed. Sarah giggled too. Deep down, he felt proud. So what should I do now? Well, you are here, but he is not. So I think you've already done what you need to do. I dropped out of school, Dad. Can I live here? Of course, as much as you want. But studying is important. Maybe you can finish it at a local university. Your room is the same as you left it. He was delighted at the thought. Thank you, Dad. She smiled. For an instant, he saw Carla's features in her face. But it quickly passed. Sarah was his. The phone rang. Walker picked up the phone. A man's voice asked for Sarah. He immediately realized who it was. It's for you, honey, he told her. Who is this? She asked. Walker just shrugged. Some things his daughter had to decide for herself. Hello, she said, picking up the phone. Then she listened for a long time without saying a word. Just put it in your Marilyn, you bastard, because you'll never put it in me, you little piece of shit. Fuck you. She hung up with a bang. Walker blinked. These were the first curse words he had ever heard from his daughter. Sarah looked at him and then blushed in realization. God, he said. Sorry, Dad, she said, but there was a smile on her face. Walker burst out laughing, and then Sarah started giggling too. They were still hugging when Carla walked through the door. What's happened? She asked. They sat down and explained to Carla that there would be no wedding and that Sarah was moving back home. A man who cheats on his woman is not a man, Walker said, looking straight at Carla. He knew what she was thinking. She blushed slightly at his comment. Her words that she wanted to date her ex-lover were still hanging in the air. You don't own me. These were her exact words when he became furious at this idea. Walker knew that Johnny was still out there in the shadows. He had already made plans for this, evil plans born of anger. But now Sarah was home. He wanted revenge. He conceived these terrible plans. But now Sarah had to be taken into account. He already felt a deep sense of guilt for hiding the terrible truth from her, telling her the opposite of what the DNA test results showed. Murder, chaos, these thoughts flashed through his mind. He even went so far as to prepare for it. But could he really do this? In the heat of anger, Walker knew he probably could. But when did the rage subside? When his usual calmness returned, it made him think. Sarah gave him a strange look, and Walker immediately cleared his mind and relaxed. She always felt his moments of tension, always. The women went into the kitchen, and Walker took the newspaper and sat down in the living room. Carla, the woman he had loved for over 2 decades, the mother of his daughter, she was lying and perhaps cheating, although he still didn't know for sure. Not knowing the truth was the most painful thing. Now he didn't know what to do with it at all. The fat man was sitting on the other side of the table, almost bald, with a half-smoked but extinguished black cigar clutched in his teeth. He looked exactly like a character from the movies. 30 days have passed, and we have nothing. She goes to work, then goes home, sometimes goes shopping. If she does anything with Dr. Hansen, it's only in the cafeteria or the restroom at work, because we checked everything else. We see them talking, and it is clear that they are friendly, but nothing more. What about those evenings when she gets home late? Walker asked. Every time this happens, there are a lot of cops and paramedics around. As far as we can tell, your wife is not cheating. That doesn't mean she's never done it, but in the last month, definitely not. Walker looked at the photographs. Carla talks to the man. Then Carla gets into a taxi. Carla is in the store. Carla enters the hairdresser. Nothing. Only one photo stuck in his head. The man has his hands up and an angry expression on his face. Carla turns away at this moment. Her posture is tense. The fat man handed him the bill. Walker wrote out the check, thanked him, and left. So Carla was telling the truth. She said she wouldn't have an affair, and it seemed like she really meant it. But he was sure that something had happened, and for a very long time. This was probably rare, given that her business trips only happened every few years. What he couldn't understand was why, if she had been cheating all this time and getting away with it, she suddenly decided to ask his permission. It didn't make any sense. Guilt? Or did she disrespect him so much that she thought he would just accept it, allow it? Will she allow another man to touch her, to possess her body? This was something he simply could not allow without losing his mind. Walker forced himself to think about something else. It was too painful to think about it. A long-forgotten episode surfaced in his memory, a girl, for him just a moment in the past. For her, it was not a moment. He still bore the long scar on his body that she had left in a fit of mad rage. Now he finally understood what kind of emotions could lead to such an act. Jonathan was still there, still in the hospital. Carla still worked side by side with him every day, and Walker now knew that they were lovers. Contacting a detective agency would never have occurred to him before, but that was then, and this is now. He thought about just sitting down and finding out everything, making her tell the truth, the whole truth. But Sarah was at home. He just couldn't do it in front of her. So he went to work, then returned home, maintaining the appearance of a normal life. I waited for the right moment, carefully choosing my words in my mind. One evening, Carla returned home exactly on time. "Hello, dear," she said joyfully, entering the house. It seemed that she did not even suspect what kind of torment he was experiencing. Their short separation, the terrible quarrel, all this seemed to be erased. Carla acted as if nothing had happened. He sat down with the newspaper, flipping through the pages, but not seeing any of them. Sarah enrolled in a local college. She chose evening and day classes. Walker deliberately didn't bring up the topic of Carla and Jonathan. He just didn't want any unpleasant conversations while Sarah was around. It wasn't easy. Now he had a couple of hours, so, collecting his thoughts, he went to the kitchen and sat down. "Would you like some juice, honey?" asked Carla. "Of course," he replied. That was all he could get out. In his thoughts, he was shouting at her, demanding to know how many times she had been with this man, how long had this been going on. All those receipts, her week-long trips to different conferences, the meetings that took place every 2 years, told a sordid story. How can you spend a week in another city and not receive a hotel bill? Only 2 of her nearly dozen trips came with accommodation bills. And now this man was here. She even told Walker what she was going to do. Does this mean their romance has already begun? He just didn't know. And this was the worst of all. Walker tried to open his mouth to speak as he watched Carla busily prepare dinner. It didn't work out. He sighed heavily and returned to the living room. His biggest fear was that she would lie. He could accept the fact that Sarah was not his own daughter. It did not change anything, because she was still his daughter. Even a romance, a moment of weakness. Perhaps it could be survivable with time, But he wasn't sure. But he could not accept the lie. Walker began to avoid intimacy. Several times Carla asked him if he was going to bed, and he replied that he would come as soon as he finished watching the TV show. He waited until she was asleep before entering the bedroom. Several times Carla rolled over and tried to hug him, but he made excuses, such as that he needed to go to the bathroom. Each time he stayed there so long that when he came out, she was already asleep. Finally, after a few weeks, she simply stopped asking and went to bed in silence. The thought of sex with Carla now invariably brought up images of Jonathan in his head, and this led to bouts of rage. Then the rage gave way to a nauseating feeling, and this was even worse. Over time, Walker learned to turn off his thoughts to avoid thinking about it. This helped for a while. This helped so much that one evening, while Sarah was in class, Carla came out of the bedroom in a short, transparent nightie. Walker forced himself not to think about anything. Carla was passionate. Her touch fueled desire. "I need you, honey. I love you so much," she whispered. He ran his hand over her familiar body, allowing his body to work without the involvement of his mind. Her taste instantly made him completely aroused. It was pleasant, familiar. It always affected him. They were still in the middle of it when he heard the front door open. Walker realized that Sarah had returned. He felt her stop, listening, and then giggle softly and go to her room. For a while, life became calm again. But then Carla began to change again. She would either have fun or fall into long periods of gloom. Walker decided to follow her himself, not wanting to spend $500 a month on the services of a detective agency. It was easy for him to find time. His job now allowed him to do a lot using his mobile phone and wireless laptop. For several days in a row, nothing suspicious happened. Carla left the building, got into a taxi, and drove home. Walker was easily ahead of her, taking shortcuts unlike the taxi, which took the long road, clearly overclocking the meter. One afternoon, there was a commotion at the entrance to the building. Several ambulances arrived. He realized that Carla would be delayed and simply went home. But one day, he saw Jonathan. The man left the building and waited, constantly looking at his watch. Only then did Walker notice how tall and massive the man was. Before that, he had only seen him sitting in the hospital lobby when he threatened him and in a few photographs. About 10 minutes later, Carla appeared. They spoke briefly, then disappeared behind one of the massive columns at the entrance. Walker only saw Carla's back. She was talking to the man for quite a long time. Then he saw Jonathan's arms wrap around her waist with obvious closeness. Carla stood on her tiptoes, leaned forward, and disappeared from view. Walker knew she kissed him. A quick kiss, a happy smile, a slight wave of her hand, and she headed towards a taxi, which immediately took her away. That's when he made a mistake. Filled with rage, he jumped out of the car and walked toward Jonathan. He just came out from behind the column and, seeing him, blushed deeply. Then he slightly put one leg forward. It looked strange. "I told you what I was going to do, you bastard," Walker blurted out, raising his fist. His first mistake was an unprepared confrontation. The second is that he has never been in a fight since elementary school. Then he lost. Jonathan dodged and punched him, causing Walker's head to spin. Before he could come to his senses, a second blow followed. His legs gave way and he collapsed to the ground. Something slammed into his ribs, turning him onto his side. He saw Jonathan kicking him, but he could do nothing but cover himself with his hands. "Well, do you like it, son of a bitch?" Jonathan growled, bending over him. His face was a mask of rage. "Leave my wife alone," Walker wheezed, holding his sides. "It's up to her, asshole. If you can't cope, it's easy for me to help. Who are you anyway to threaten me? Do you think you can just walk away from this?" Jonathan delivered the final blow and turned away. "I'll kill you," Walker squeezed out. He stopped, looked at him with hatred, then left. Walker, overcoming the pain, returned to the car and drove home. He felt pathetic. This man had dealt with him like a child. Filled with rage, he went into the garage, loaded the stun gun, took a rope and a new axe, and put everything in the trunk. He made his decision again. Then he entered the house. "What's happened?" Carla exclaimed when she saw him. "Nothing," he muttered, sitting down in a chair. "Let me see." Carla came closer. "Get away from me," he barked. She looked at him angrily and went into the kitchen. Sarah left her room. After looking him over, she brought water and began to carefully blot his swollen face. Then she applied something burning to the cut eyebrow. "We need to talk, Dad. When Mom isn't around," she said quietly. Walker simply nodded. Carla feigned anger at Walker for the next couple of days. He ignored it, ignored her pointed questions. He didn't mention what he saw. It just didn't make sense. But it was obvious that she knew what had happened. "We're not doing anything, Walker. Really, nothing," she told him just once. Walker didn't answer. Her lover grabbed him, beat him, and did it with ease. Now what does she think of him? He couldn't even protect his home, his family. The only thing that stopped him from taking decisive action was Sarah. The next day, when he returned from work, Sarah was already at home. She returned very early. "It was that man, right?" she asked almost immediately. "Yes, it's my fault. I tried to deal with him, but I couldn't." "It's not your fault. This is Mom's. I know about this, well, at least part of it. We had a terrible fight this morning. I told her to stop seeing him, but she denied doing it at all. I think she was still dating, or at least dating. I don't know how or when, but I think so. All these trips out of town." "Are you going to divorce her, Dad?" asked Sarah. "I didn't even think about it," he replied. "I hate her. How could she do this to us?" Sarah started crying. "Don't hate her. She's your mother. Sometimes the flesh is weak, so we just need to figure out what to do next. It just can't go on forever." "I don't think so," she said. "No, he can't," he answered bitterly. Sarah sat quietly for several long seconds. "Dad, I know," she finally said. "What do you know, honey? I went to that man, I rummaged around and found out everything. I've felt for a long time that something was wrong. I saw it in you. As soon as I saw him, I understood. So I went there, to the hospital. I was going to tell him to leave Mom alone, but as soon as I saw him, he has." Walker sighed. "The same red hair as yours, honey, same facial features, and he's tall. How are you?" Walker said with a heavy heart. Sarah sat silently. "So what? You are my dad. He may be part of my blood, but he is not my father. You are my father." She hugged him so tightly that for a moment he couldn't breathe. "I'm sorry I lied to you about that, Sarah. I just didn't want you to get hurt. Yes, I know. This is part of why I know you are my dad. That man doesn't care about anyone. He could be grown in a test tube and he wouldn't care," she said. "Now he knows about you, right?" "Yes, I think he already knew. I'm sure Mom told him, because he wasn't surprised at all when he saw me." "Aren't you surprised?" "No, he knew who I was from the first second." "What did he say?" "Not so much, to be honest. He knew my name and said he was proud that Beautiful. He also said that he had seen me many times before. I didn't know that. He has photos that he showed me. He was here, near the house, just standing on the street sometimes. When I told him that I wanted him to leave my mother alone, he replied that it was up to her. He told me the same thing," Walker said. "And then he said that if he and my mother were together, we would become a real family." Walker felt a flash of anger again. I slapped him in the face. Strong, but he didn't even move. He just looked at me. She grinned. "That's more than I managed," Walker laughed. "Let's leave," Sarah suddenly said. "What?" "We'll leave. Let's find a place to live. This simply cannot continue. We feel good together." "What about your mother?" Walker asked. "To hell with Mom," she blurted out. Walker blinked in surprise. This was only the second time he'd heard her swear. Such a dirty word from such beautiful lips. He scolded her with a soft smile. Sarah just laughed. Carla returned home to an empty house 3 days later. There was a note on the table. She took it and read, "You and Johnny have a happy life." Walker didn't want to leave a note, but Sarah insisted. She was really angry with her mother. Carla sat down and cried. Then she picked up the phone and called Jonathan. Walker left me, she said. Well, that's great, he answered. No, it's not great. I can't see you anymore. It's over. The hell with it. You belong to me, he said sharply. No, I need to be with Walker and my daughter. Let that pathetic bastard go on his way. Now you are free. You have no more excuses. We'll never be together, Johnny. I already told you it was a mistake. It's a mistake, of course. You belong to me. You always have. His voice became angry. No, I love Walker, she said firmly. How the hell can you love this weakling? I give you so much more than he ever could, and anyway, Sarah is my daughter, not his. Carla hung up. The phone rang instantly, but she ignored the call. She dialed Walker's cell phone number, the answering machine. I called him at work the next day. He wasn't there. Afraid to drive, she took a taxi, driving around the streets searching. The bill turned out to be huge. A week passed, then to nothing. After checking the bank accounts, she discovered that half of them were missing. She took time off from work in an attempt to find Walker, but was unsuccessful. I called the college, the same result. Jonathan kept calling, she didn't answer. Then she saw him drive slowly past the house several times, but he just looked and drove on. Carla began to feel slightly uneasy. On impulse, she took out her old bike and rode to the nightclub where she and Walker first met. Walker's car was in the parking lot. She went inside. Walker and Sarah were sitting at a table talking to an older woman. Carla walked over to them and sat down. Hello, Carla. This is our friend Helen, Walker introduced her, and it seemed that he was not even surprised by her arrival. Well, the whole company is assembled, Helen said with a smile. How did you get here, Carla? Walker asked. On a bicycle, she answered. Is it true? He was slightly surprised, knowing her fear of cars. They looked at each other. There was not a trace of anger in his face. What the hell is going on here, Walker? She blurted out. Sarah is my daughter too, Walker said. No, she's not she. Her face then turned red as she realized what she was about to say. She still wasn't sure how knowledgeable Walker was. Sarah is my daughter. She is already an adult. She can decide for herself. We decided to live together for a while. We have a lot to sort out, and our friend Helen is here helping us, Walker said calmly. Who is this woman, and what does she have to do with this? I've been seeing her for a while now, and we're talking. Now both Sarah and I. You need to come home, Carla blurted out, ignoring his words. No, honey. Not yet, Walker said. I don't. I can't. I love you. I want to be with you. You must come home, Carla insisted. Darling, love is when you stay together no matter what. You can't be with a man and still have a toy on the side, Helen told her. Who the hell is this woman? This doesn't concern her at all, Carla screamed. Actually, it's concerning, Mom. Dad has been talking to Helen for a long time. He and I have been dating her for over a week now. He needed to figure things out, and so did I, Sarah said. Sarah, I please. Mother, we're not coming home. Not now and perhaps never. You will always be my mom, but now I'm ashamed of you, so Dad and I will live together. You can't do this, said Carla. Oh, as much as we can, Walker replied. Carla jumped up, gave them a furious look, and ran out. That's what I thought, Walker, Helen said. He just nodded. The old woman was right. Sometimes the only thing left to do is move on. I wish I had met you years ago, he said. Maybe my life wouldn't be so confusing, he added. Oh, I would have anyway. But it's never too late. Tomorrow is a new day. Anyway, forget about the boyfriend. He's not worth it. She smiled, patting his hand. And one more thing. You have too many unresolved problems in your head, and they cannot be solved in a few hours. Come to me, we'll talk. Maybe at my house for more privacy since your wife now knows where you might be. She pressed a business card into his hand, then handed another to Sarah. Walker and Sarah stood up to leave. These 2 weeks were not spent in vain. The elderly woman had already helped him once. She was right then, too, And perhaps if he hadn't been late home that night, things might have turned out differently. Show her that you love her. Let her know that you care about her, was her advice. Walker rushed home that night, ready to talk to his wife, ready to forgive and move on. But instead, he found them together in the hospital. All they did was just sit and talk, but even that looked terrible. His idea was to attack Jonathan, kill him, and then, what would happen next? Of course, if he had caught him by surprise, he could have hurt him, but then he would have lost everything. He told Helen about his plans. She listened and didn't even look surprised. She then explained that such an act would destroy not only that man, but himself, his daughter, everyone. The real problem was his wife, and that was what he had to come to terms with. Helen was right, and now he understood it. Madness. He was seriously considering murder. He even lied to Sarah about the DNA test results. It was out of character. Helen explained to him that hatred and emotions can destroy everything that really matters. And for him, the most important thing was Sarah. He felt almost at peace now, so he took her hand and they left the bar to go home. But the anger was still there, and he knew it would be a long time before he could let it go completely. Walker had just touched the key fob to unlock the car door when a sharp pain pierced his head. He felt his face slam into the gravel of the parking lot. I tried to turn over, but somewhere in the distance I heard screams. He knew it was Sarah screaming. He managed to get up on all fours, but then something hit him in the side, and he fell back to the ground. Turning over onto his back, he saw Jonathan above him. There was something in his hand. "You threatened me, you bastard. Carla is mine now. I will kill you," he shouted. Walker tried to crawl back and stand up, but he was hit in the face again and fell backward. His mouth filled with blood, he tried to breathe, but he almost couldn't. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Sarah. She seemed to be running away, and he was grateful for that. He tried to shout at her to run as far as possible, but he could not make a sound. Another blow landed on his thigh, and his leg went numb. Looking up, he saw the blurry figure of a man, then his huge fist raised to strike. Walker braced himself for the inevitable. Jonathan suddenly froze, opened his mouth, and then fell to his knees. Walker crawled back, expecting him to attack him again, but this did not happen. The man seemed confused and sank to his elbows. And then he saw Sarah. She took a step back and kicked Jonathan hard from behind. Her strike was accurate. Jonathan screamed and then vomited. "Don't you dare touch my dad, you bastard," she shouted. Sarah swung again and hit him even harder. The man fell face down and fell silent. "Dad, are you okay?" She was already nearby. "Yes, I think so. Sarah, your tongue is getting worse," he said. At such a moment, it sounded completely ridiculous. Walker struggled to his feet. What the hell happened? Where did he come from? Every word was difficult for him. "Probably keeping an eye on Mom," Sarah replied. "What happened to him?" "You dropped the key fob. I grabbed it and opened the trunk. This stun gun works damn well," she smiled. "Like your right leg," Walker tried to laugh, spitting out more blood. Jonathan stirred and groaned. "Just a second," Sarah said. She lifted his shirt, pressed the stun gun against his bare skin, and held it there for about 15 seconds. Walker watched as the man's body twitched and then went still. "This will be enough until the police arrive," she said contentedly. Walker tried to laugh, but suddenly realized that he couldn't breathe. The world began to spin, and he lost consciousness. Walker was in the hospital. Sarah was sitting next to him. Nothing in the world hurts like broken ribs, and he had 6 of them. He was bandaged and had surgery to repair his punctured lung. She and Sarah discussed her plans after graduation. He groaned as he tried to move. "Just lie still, Dad. It won't hurt as much," she told him. "That's how it is. I fought with this guy twice, and both times I ended up losing," he squeezed out. "It doesn't matter. We caught him." "Well, you caught it in any case. Listen, how did you know that there was a stun gun there?" "No way. I was actually looking for a tire iron. I cut my finger on your axe. For a second, I even thought about using it, but then I saw this stun gun," She raised her hand with a bandaged finger and giggled. At that moment, a policeman appeared at the door. "How are you, buddy?" As soon as he spoke, Walker immediately recognized him. It was the same cop who stopped him on the highway a few months ago. The policeman looked at Sarah sitting next to him and hesitated. Sarah looked at him, then smiled. Walker also looked at him, then at her. The young man was very attractive, several years older than Sarah. "Everything is fine, I'm alive, considering the circumstances, officer." "Well, I'm glad to see that your friend has all his arms and legs in place." He laughed, finally turning to Walker. "Do you know about this?" "Yeah, I'm a cop. I've already questioned Dr. Hansen. He says you attacked him, threatened him. In general, Officer Tim Harrington, at your service." "I didn't attack. This time." "We know. Damn it, this little girl gave him a good time. He spent a long time in the operating room. He had to have an operation in his main male place." He glanced at Sarah. "Oh, I didn't mean to." Sarah covered her mouth with her hand. "Remind me not to make you angry." The policeman just shrugged. "Is Sarah in trouble?" Walker asked. "No. Self-defense and the defense of another person are completely legal. Hell, I think she should actually be given a medal. She probably saved your life." He looked at Sarah with interest, now smiling. Walker saw her blush and looked down. This guy had a gun in his pocket and also used a baton. The prosecutor wants to charge him with first-degree assault with a deadly weapon. Maybe he can prove intent to kill, but probably not. He has money, he'll hire some damn lawyer to try to turn it all out. Although, of course, he'll have to explain how he got so many photos in his car. Looks like he's been stalking you and your family for a long time. "Follow me? A gun? I didn't know that." "Yes, it makes you wonder what could have happened." He looked pointedly at Walker. "He also has a history of assault, and now he suddenly became a person of interest in an unsolved murder a few years ago at the college he attended." Walker thought for a moment. "You know, threatening to commit a crime is also a violation of the law," he said. "So that means I'm in trouble too." "No, we already have enough to do with those who actually do something. Stun gun, right?" He looked at Sarah again, then smiled again. "Anyway, I need your testimony for the report," he said, turning to Walker. "All I remember is being hit from behind," Walker replied. "I see. Then perhaps I should ask the lady, you saw everything, right, Sarah?" "Yes," Sarah answered shyly. Walker saw her run her hand through her hair. He'd seen this before. "Maybe we can go to a cafe. It'll be quieter there while I record your testimony. Let your dad rest. Let's have some coffee at the same time." "Okay," Sarah was clearly delighted. Walker winked at her, and she blushed again. An hour later, Carla came in. She sat down and looked at him silently. "What do you need, Carla?" "I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. I didn't know Jonathan was capable of something like that." Walker noticed that his name was now Jonathan instead of Johnny. "Well, I told him that I would kill him. I think that made him angry." "I know, but you wouldn't, would you?" she asked. "Probably not. I was going to. Or I thought I was going to. Everything was so confusing. For a long time I felt only anger, but after talking to Helen, she made me see what is really important." "God, I ruined everything so bad, didn't I?" Carla's eyes sparkled. "Yes, I think you can say that." They just looked at each other for a long time. "You know, Carla, if you had told me right away that you were pregnant with his child, it wouldn't have changed anything for me. I loved you, and that's all that mattered. Honey, I wasn't even sure whose child she was, and I was afraid to tell you. I hoped that she was yours. I thought you wouldn't want us if you found out. And then, when Sarah was born, I understood. And I knew that you would understand too. But you were so happy, so proud. I just couldn't tell you. Then why the birth control pills? I thought we were trying to have a baby." Carla blushed. "I was afraid. If we had a child together, he would look completely different from Sarah. You would understand, but I just couldn't allow it. I'm so sorry." She lowered her head, a look of sadness on her face. "We lived 20 years in a lie, right?" he asked. "Walker, we were happy, weren't we? That's the only thing that matters. I really love you, honey. I'll never do anything like that again. Now, will you be honest with me?" "Yes, ask about anything." "Then tell me, how long did your affair with Jonathan last?" Carla hesitated, then blushed. Walker understood. Now there was no longer any doubt. It was a mistake. I don't even know why. Maybe because he was the first man in my life. It was only just one time. After Jonathan returned to town. Finally, she confessed. Then she looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Walker just looked at her. He suddenly realized that he had no idea who this woman really was. Now she seemed weak and frightened to him. Mistakes, weakness of the flesh, everyone has it. He knew that deep down he had the same flaws. It was possible that he might be untrue, and he knew that under certain circumstances he might lie. He had already done this for his own daughter to protect her from pain. He realized this during those long afternoon and evening conversations with Helen. The woman was wise. Somehow she started the healing process for him. With honesty and trust, a person can start over. Without this, there is no hope. Pregnancy, lies, even cheating. There was not a single drop of doubt left in his soul. Despite all this, he still loved Carla. Walker knew that in time he could forgive all of this. I mean before, all these trips out of town. Oh God, Walker, you know? She covered her face with her hands. "Honey, I'm so sorry," she finally said. "You need to tell everything. I can't handle secrets anymore." "Fine." We met at that conference, and the first time it happened unexpectedly. Then we ended up in his room. I don't know why. Maybe just because we already had something before, even before I met you. I was terribly ashamed. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid. But you continued? "Yes, only at conferences and not at all. Then he got married, and I thought it was all over, but they separated." "When did he move here?" "Yes, just once. He continued to persuade me. I refused, but then he threatened that he would tell you if I didn't agree, and I did it. I thought maybe if I asked your permission, you would allow it, and oh, I don't know, it's all so confusing." "I'm not coming home, Carla," he told her. "Oh, no, please, darling," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "No, it's over, Carla." Her shoulders sagged. She stopped at the door and turned around. "Is there any chance, Walker? Any chance for us?" "No," he said in an even voice. "Not a single one." The nurse was removing the bandages, preparing to replace them after examining the stitches. Another week, they told him. And then he can return home to Sarah. He thought a lot, wanted to meet Carla, talk to her. His mind was still a mess, memories of good times spanning over 20 years coming back to mind over and over again. Too much has happened. 2 decades of trust, familiar life, all this has disappeared. Walker desperately wanted to go back and wanted everything to be the same. But before, now it has been destroyed. He told her it was over, but deep down he knew he wasn't being completely honest with himself. Carla called every day, asked how he was feeling, and was worried. It was frighteningly normal. They talked about Sarah, about their hopes for her future. She said that she was finally able to pass her license, but then she got a flat tire. He explained to her how to change it herself, although he suspected that Sarah had helped her. Calmly, they discussed the accounts that Carla now handled herself and the dam drain in the basement that caused them trouble from time to time. Frighteningly normal. Walker knew that Sarah had gone on a date with Officer Harrington, and when he thought about it, he couldn't help but smile. They're a great couple. Who knows where this will lead? He said as the nurse tore off the last piece of the bandage. "Sorry," she replied. "Well, it looks like you are healing very well. Lie down, I'll call the doctor to check it out." She turned to the door, and at that moment Sarah appeared. One glance was enough. "Dad, this. She burst into tears, rushed to him, and hugged him. Walker ignored the sharp pain in his side. He was released on bail. Mom was seriously injured, she sobbed. Oh no, Walker gasped. His world was turned upside down again. Walker sat by Carla's bedside, gently holding her hand. Too much has happened, too much upheaval. But in the current situation, he simply could not leave. He knew that any healing would take much longer than just the wound's healing. He came every day, 6 days in a row, talking to her in a soft voice. The nurses came, checked the equipment, and cast significant glances at him. Every day he stayed after visiting hours, but no one said anything to him. He sat long after midnight, talking to her, waiting. Of her entire face, only her swollen lips were visible, the rest was hidden by bandages. She would have died, there was no doubt about it, if the neighbor had not noticed that the front door was open and decided to check. Sarah returned to her college classes, but firmly said that as soon as her mother woke up, he should call her immediately. Every evening she came and sat with him and Carla. Police found Jonathan hiding in a motel. He denied everything, but Carla managed to fight back. The evidence was undeniable. Marks of teeth, particles of skin under her nails. There was blood, both of them. Carla managed to land at least one accurate blow, and several of his stitches came apart. In this, she and her daughter were similar. There will be no bail this time. Thanks to a blood test, there was a DNA match to a previous crime. It was only a matter of time, but a second attack made matters easier. Officer Harrington stopped by to check on them. So far, the police had little information about what happened. Jonathan refused to talk, and Carla was in a coma. He and Walker talked for a long time, and at one point the officer admitted that he liked Sarah and asked if Walker had any objections to them meeting. As long as you treat her well and never lie to her, that's fine with me, Walker replied. With a girl like this, I understand that, he smiled. I can already roughly imagine what she's capable of if she gets angry. The next day, Carla opened her eyes. Looking around in confusion, she fell back into sleep. Hello, honey, she said when she woke up for the second time. 3 long weeks passed before Carla was discharged. 3 long weeks of walking up and down the hallway, always with either Walker or Sarah by her side. 3 long weeks of quiet conversations. Finally, Walker felt like he understood her, at least as far as it was possible. Carla will forever be scarred, with a limp that has now become part of her life. The marks on his face weren't that bad, but the hollow where his left cheekbone used to be would probably remain forever. He even started talking about plastic surgery, but she just shook her head. Personal retribution, perhaps. Only time could provide the answer. Walker returned to work. Life goes on. Sarah went to classes again. They took turns on duty at the hospital. On the day of discharge, Walker helped Carla out of her wheelchair outside. She grabbed his arm as she struggled to get into the car. Sarah sat in the back seat, smiling quietly. Walker looked at his daughter, their eyes meeting. Words were not needed, they both understood everything. Despite everything, he loved Carla in the end. After all, he loved his daughter. House. It was time to return home. Life has a way of driving people into traps. Responsibility forces you to care for someone, be it elderly parents, a spouse, or even a child who, as an adult, still reaches out for help. Walker felt exactly that way, trapped. His wife, Carla, was now his problem. She recovered, but it was a long, painful process. Love is long gone. It was killed by betrayal and lies. There were moments of shock, of mad rage, when he learned the truth about Carl. He even imagined revenge and took several steps in this direction. But over time, awareness came. Blind rage would only bring him down to the level of Jonathan, the man he had come to hate. Walker would simply leave Carla, and that's what he was going to do. But before he could finish the job, the trap slammed shut. His wife had become disabled, and he could not simply dump this burden on his daughter's shoulders. He loved Sarah more than life itself, and could not afford to do this to her. Sarah was young, beautiful, she had a future and the right to happiness, to a full life. He understood perfectly well that if he left Carla, Sarah would take care of her, sacrifice herself and her dreams. For Sarah, Walker was ready to do anything. The choice was obvious. So he stayed, caring for Carla, not for the sake of his wife, but for the sake of his daughter. The trap of life has turned into a series of identical days. He did what he had to do. There was no end in sight. He fed her, dressed her, washed her, even helped her with the toilet at first. Every day was similar to the previous one. Only the evenings, when Sarah dropped by for a visit, were an outlet for him. During these few hours, he could leave home. Every evening, he went to the old bar. Every evening, the same old woman was waiting for him there. A former therapist, she never asked anything, never demanded anything. I just saw his pain and tried to help. They talked quietly for hours. He found his strength in her words. When she suggested hiring a caregiver for Carla, Walker knew she was right. The first person to respond to the ad was Melanie. After a few minutes of conversation, he already knew that he would take her, partly because of her intelligence, partly because of the little girl who stood next to her, holding her mother's hand tightly, with huge round eyes and a finger in his mouth. Walker glanced at Sarah as she took his arm, his heart filled with pride. She met his gaze and smiled, and the music started playing. At that moment, Sarah was the most beautiful creature on earth. Her white dress flowed like the embodiment of purity. Walker was sure of it. This moment filled him with happiness. A long time ago, he almost forgot what joy was. He wiped a tear away with his sleeve, noticing Sarah smiling. He leaned down and touched her cheek with his lips, and in that moment he gave the greatest gift a father can give to his daughter. The music continued to play. Finding out that your wife, with whom you have lived for more than 20 years, has been cheating with her ex-lover all this time is a blow. In the first moments, rage clouded my eyes. He planned revenge, but the very thought of it disgusted him. But the fact that the lover turned out to be the real father of his adored daughter, this blow was even worse. But it didn't last long. Sarah was his, from the very moment she was born. He was standing there when she was born. She is his, and nothing on earth could change that. Physical revenge failed. His only attempt to attack Jonathan ended in failure. Walker didn't know how to fight, and he was bigger and stronger. It's just a matter of genetics. But as a person, Jonathan was worthless. The judge gave it 3 years. Too little for the pain caused. Walker was going to just walk away from Carla, break up this marriage. But first, her wounds. Simply leaving when she was so crippled meant leaving her without a home. And Sarah, she wouldn't let her mother be alone. She would sacrifice her life. That's why he stayed. He thought Carla would recover quickly. But as soon as she returned home, a blood clot caused a massive stroke. And now Walker had no choice. There was no more love. But the debt remained. Who would have thought that this plump and vivacious girl he spent countless hours watching grow and learn would grow into such a vision? Walker looked at the man who was waiting for them at the altar as they walked slowly to the music, a smile on his face. Tim Harrington, the tall, burly man she chose, was handsome in his tuxedo. He was waiting for his prize. Police officer, who would even dream of such a thing? A doctor, a lawyer, perhaps an executive at a large corporation, that's what Walker would expect. Maybe even a prominent politician, but it was her choice, and this choice fell on this worthy young man. As they approached the dais, Walker glanced briefly at his wife, Carla. She sat quietly, watching, but there was a smile on her face. It had been many months since he had seen her smile, and he took another look to be sure. Yes, she smiled. Her regular nurse, Melanie, was sitting nearby, and Walker noticed that Melanie was holding Carla's hand tightly. The rest went by in a blur. Everything happened very quickly. Tim lifted the thin veil, leaned down, and kissed Sarah tenderly. At that moment, Walker looked into her eyes, the same as her mother's. The same smile that he had seen on Carla's face a moment earlier was clearly reflected in her gaze. And then somehow they were already at the reception. The huge hall they rented could barely cope with the number of guests. All the seats were occupied, and many were just standing and talking. When the huge limousine finally drove away and the endless stream of people shaking his hand stopped, He helped Carla into their car. Melanie stood nearby, silently waiting. "Should I come over tonight and help, Walker?" she asked. "Thank you, but we will cope. I think we want to be alone today. The rest of the day can be taken 7 days a week." "Fine. I'll see you in the morning then," she smiled. Walker looked after her as she walked to her car. Melanie was certainly attractive. If the circumstances had been different, he knew he could have followed his thoughts, but now there was no hope, no chance. The long day, filled with all those obligatory words and actions, is finally over. Now Walker felt he could relax. They pulled up to the house, and he walked around the car to help Carla get out. Every day she got a little better, gaining strength in the right side of her body. He watched as she reached for the doorknob and was pleased when she managed to turn it again and open the door. Carla then turned around and gave him a smile. Walker smiled back and nodded. "Okay," he said. Melanie's efforts to restore Carla produced amazing results. Walker kept his anger well hidden in the deepest recesses of his mind, and then, when Carla was released from the hospital for the first time after the beating, he asked her all the painful questions. She still spoke clearly, albeit with difficulty. The blisters that covered her skin due to a brain hemorrhage disappeared, and the medical team was surprised by her fairly quick recovery. "It's very good that you are nearby. It helps her recover psychologically," the elderly doctor told him. Unable to tolerate the unknown, Walker asked her about everything that tormented his soul. Carla could no longer lie, he was sure of it, and through her tears she told him the whole truth. That man, Jonathan, was the first in her life, and meeting him a few years later at a country conference was just an accident. Carla chose Walker over Jonathan. One thing led to another. The meeting became simply a way to find out how their lives turned out. Jonathan was the one who took her virginity, and seducing her again was not difficult. A few drinks weakened moral boundaries, and Carla woke up in his bed. She was overcome with sudden shame and knew that if Walker ever found out, she would lose him. When she found out she was pregnant, fear of what she had done led her to take action to protect her marriage. The day Sarah was born, Carla already knew the truth. And then, afraid that the second child might reveal the secret, she decided not to give birth again. Why did these meetings continue every year? She didn't have an answer. The fact that Jonathan was her first somehow stayed in her mind, and that made it easier for her to cheat. Every time after that, she felt guilty, assuring herself that she would not do this again. But every time it happened again. This truth hurt, fueled anger in Walker, but he could hardly restrain himself so as not to explode. He made the decision to leave as soon as she could take care of herself. This determination lasted exactly 5 days. One tiny blood clot changed everything. Life has set a trap. When Walker walked into her bedroom one morning, just 5 days after she was discharged, to wake Carla up for breakfast, he took one look to know she was in trouble. He followed the ambulance in his car, watching with alarm as it was taken inside. Her face was deathly gray, and at that moment he thought that this might be the end. The stroke was severe. The blood clot, wherever it came from, hit an artery on the left side of her neck. The right side of her face sagged lifelessly, and her right arm and leg almost stopped moving. An ultrasound showed blockage of blood vessels on the right side, but it was the almost complete blockage on the left that was the final blow. "I'm afraid your wife will now require constant care, sir," the elderly doctor said softly as they stood outside her room. "How long?" Walker asked. Only time and God can answer this question. First a cerebral hemorrhage, now a severe stroke. It may take a very long time if she recovers at all. Walker sat for a long time, lost in thought, not noticing the bustle of the hospital around him. Finally, he sighed heavily and stood up. The decision about what his life would be like had already been made for him. Finding Melanie was truly a blessing. Sarah insisted on dropping out to help look after Carla, but Walker made a big fuss about it. He even raised his voice, which completely confused Sarah. She had never seen him like this before. It was a shock. "Okay, Dad," she conceded in a quiet voice. Walker immediately hugged her and apologized. Her studies were much more important, and he managed to convince Sarah that he would take care of her mother himself. Money was tight since he had to quit his job, but Carla's state disability helped at least a little. In addition, Walker always saved and invested money carefully, so he began looking for a nurse. If he is careful with his finances and there are no sudden disasters, he will manage. Melanie was simply perfect. Tall and slender, pretty and incredibly neat in her own way. She was in her early 30s and came every morning and helped with Carla. Experience in physical therapy was a huge advantage. In addition, she had a 5-year-old daughter, and this work allowed Melanie to continue evening courses in order to receive a full-fledged education. Walker looked forward to her arrival every day. Her sincere smile warmed him, and it was always as accurate as a clock. Very quickly, she ceased to be just an employee. Even Carla began to react to her. Very soon, she was on her feet first with a cane and then without. Recently, she could almost completely dress herself and even help around the house. It wasn't easy, but Walker noticed that Melanie was always there, allowing Carla to overcome each challenge on her own after she worked as hard as she could to take every small step forward. Now that Sarah had chosen her life partner, her room became available, and the plan was for Melanie and her daughter to move in with them. Melanie happily agreed. Walker set about organizing the bedroom and small living room next to it, turning them into personal space for the new residents. Doing everything with his own hands meant that the work would take a long time, but it helped keep him distracted. Melanie's constant presence would make life much easier, and Walker had already taken care of little Beth, her daughter, during Melanie's evening classes. Many moments reminded him of the joyful days he spent with Sarah when she was growing up. Carla was recovering very quickly. She could now walk almost normally without assistance, and her right arm began to recover, although it remained weak. But she never smiled and hardly spoke. It was only on Sarah's wedding day that her face lit up with an expression of joy. Up to this point, she had only hummed and pointed at things, but Walker had learned to understand her. All these events also influenced the trial against Jonathan, the man who treated her so cruelly. It was absolutely clear that he was a psychopath, a real stalker. One day, he broke into the house when Carla was alone, and when she refused him, he beat her without any mercy. In desperation, Carla tried to break off contact with him, hoping to save her marriage, but Jonathan did not even think about giving in. His reaction to her refusal was an outburst of rage. Carla desperately resisted, but ended up lying in a pool of blood at the threshold of her own house. Only thanks to a curious neighbor who noticed the open door, she remained alive. Walker even thought that perhaps it would have been better if things had ended differently, but he forced himself to push the thought aside. It was enough that the court rejected evidence in Jonathan's previous case due to alleged improper storage of evidence. The police had little doubt that he was involved in the earlier murder. The chain of custody has been broken, Detective Tim Harrington told Walker grimly. This turned out to be enough. Walker never fully understood all the legal intricacies. Jonathan's guilt was obvious, but without the opportunity to present evidence, this episode of the case was closed. Jonathan's lawyer took advantage of Carla's inability to testify and tried to turn the situation around by blaming Walker. Yes or no, did you attack my client without warning? He asked, citing the date Walker saw them kiss and became enraged. Yes, but... Walker began, but was immediately interrupted by the next question. Carla was presented as a jealous woman, furious that Jonathan was seeing someone else. During the struggle, she managed to scratch him, and the defense emphasized this. But the verdict still turned out to be guilty. The difference in physical strength was too obvious to accept the defense's version. For a brief moment, Walker felt satisfaction, but it was immediately replaced by shock. The judge sentenced Jonathan to only 3 years in prison. 3 short years for ruining a life, for trying to kill Carla. Walker sighed and went home, consoling himself with only one thing: the hateful look Jonathan gave as he was led away in handcuffs. After the wedding, returning home, Carla headed to her bedroom on her own. She tried more and more to do things herself. Walker was pleased that she smiled at their daughter's wedding and then at home. When she reached the door, she turned around. Sarah, she's happy, hap. The smile appeared on her face again. These were real words, not just the sounds and gestures he was used to. Yes, she is happy. She chose a good young man. Walker approached her and helped her into the bedroom. Van, she asked. Bath, of course. He went into the bathroom and turned on the water. When he returned, Carla had almost taken off her dress. He quickly helped her undress completely and lowered her into the bath. This moment was the most difficult for him. He had already lived without a woman for more than a year, and even before that his intimate life with Carla was unstable. Betrayal, quarrels, reconciliation, but there were no more emotions. Carla was still beautiful. The only change was that her pubic hair was now untouched and natural. Even the gnarly scar on her side, almost identical to his own, didn't detract from her attractiveness. Walker washed her carefully, trying his best to maintain his composure. Carla felt his touch too. She looked at him with the same look that he had seen so many times before. But he didn't give in. When she got out of the bath, he helped her dry, put her to bed, put on pajamas, covered her with a blanket, and checked the monitor. "Will you stay with me?" Carla asked softly, her voice sounding clear as a bell. Walker just shook his head. He then went into his bedroom next door, as he had done since the day he brought her home from the hospital. He lay there, listening to quiet breathing on the monitor. "Love you." He heard her voice, again as clear as a bell. He sat up abruptly. Was this a dream? After a few moments, her breathing became even and calm, and he lay down again. It was another restless night. Melanie moved in with them the week after Sarah and Tim's wedding. Walker helped her move in his truck. It took a little time. Her little daughter Beth had more things than Melanie herself. Beth was now an adorable 6-year-old girl, and Walker enjoyed hearing her laugh and play loudly. It reminded him of the past. Just 2 weeks later, Sarah and Tim returned from their honeymoon, Sarah looking radiant as always. "Tim is just perfect, Daddy," she whispered in his ear with a laugh, hugging him. Then she went to the bedroom to visit her mother. Walker was in the kitchen helping Melanie with dinner when Sarah returned. Mom began to speak much better. "When did this start?" "On your wedding day," he answered. "She spoke as soon as we got home that night." "Wow, this is wonderful. Maybe she will make a full recovery." "Maybe, dear. Let's hope." Melanie went to get Carla, and they soon returned. She got dressed herself. "I just needed to help fasten the buttons," Melanie said in a whisper with a smile. Walker looked at Carla, and she smiled back at him. Later in the day, he heard sounds from the living room and then laughter. Looking in, he saw Carla sitting on the floor playing with little Beth, and Melanie watching them from a chair, smiling. Walker chuckled and left them, returning to his work building a second bathroom with a shower in the back of the house, which was now occupied by Melanie and Beth. This addition gave them more privacy since they now had to share one bathroom. Although it didn't pose much of a problem, Walker had already seen Melanie a few times, wrapped only in a large bath towel. At first he apologized and quickly retreated, but since Melanie didn't seem to be bothered at all, he gradually got used to it. Sometimes she would go out in thin pajamas to watch TV, and it was obvious that she had nothing underneath. Walker tried not to look, but could not control his reaction, feeling remorse. He bought a small TV for her room, but she said she preferred to watch it in the living room with everyone else. Several times he had to force himself not to notice how her body moved under the thin fabric as she changed positions. One day, while he was giving Carla a bath, Melanie came in to help. It was becoming difficult for Carl to keep his balance in the water, and Melanie supported her. At that moment, her pajamas parted slightly, and Walker saw her bare breasts. His reaction was immediate, and Melanie noticed it. But since both her hands were busy, she could not do anything. She just smiled shyly, but didn't say a word, continuing to hold Carla until Walker lifted her out of the bath. They locked eyes for a moment, but Walker turned away first, blushing. Thoughts he couldn't control filled his head. After that, he more than once caught her looking at him intently, thoughtfully, and every time she noticed him staring back, she quickly looked away. It started coming to him in his dreams. But these were not dreams of passion. These were nightmares in which he was trapped with no hope of escape. In these dreams, Melanie reached out to him, but always remained beyond his reach. He knew that the reason for these dreams was his life, a trap from which there was no way out. Almost another year passed. Everyone was just living their lives. Walker began building the second bathroom many months ago, and now the work was nearing completion. It was a huge job. He knew nothing about construction, plumbing, or wiring, and every new action became a test for him. But now everything looked very good, and he felt deep satisfaction from his work. Carla recovered amazingly quickly. Even the doctors were amazed. She now always dressed herself, began to cook, and her speech became almost normal. Walker was stunned when he returned from the hardware store to see Carla in the yard on her bicycle. Previously, she was afraid of the roads and drove extremely rarely, not feeling confident. But now she rode up and down the driveway, confident in the saddle. Melanie sat on the porch and watched, smiling. Carla is progressing very quickly. Soon she will be able to take care of herself completely. Do you understand? Walker sat next to her, feeling the closeness of her body. You're almost done with the second bathroom, and now it seems like you don't need me anymore, huh? Melanie said quietly. He realized that was the question. You can live here as long as you want. Is it true? There was excitement in her voice, and she touched his forearm. Walker was immediately aware of the touch. Yes, it's true. You and Beth are part of the family now. Uncomfortable with the emotions that overwhelmed him, he rose to his feet. Melanie also stood up and suddenly hugged him for the first time. Walker reacted immediately again, and she felt it. Oh, she breathed, letting go of him. Sorry, he muttered, blushing. She looked at him and smiled. Don't apologize. This is a compliment. Then, giggling, she turned around and entered the house. Walker looked after her, thoughts racing through his head. Every day he thought more and more about her, and I couldn't do anything about it. Carla pulled up and stopped, glancing briefly at Melanie as she entered the house, then looked back at Walker. Her left eyebrow raised slightly, but she didn't say anything. Walker took a deep breath. Then he went inside, finished installing the shower, and checked it out. Everything was perfect. Melanie hugged him again when he showed her the work, causing him to have the same reaction. This time she was in no hurry to let him go. I would like. She began, but quickly retreated, leaving him standing with even more mixed feelings. This was difficult for him to deal with. Finally, in his bathroom, he solved the problem in the only way now available to him. The feeling of Melanie in his arms filled his thoughts. Later, he went to bed and again spent a restless night. Somewhere in the middle of the night, he dreamed of Melanie approaching him, unbuttoning her blouse and exposing her breasts. Walker woke up with a start, feeling wet from his overnight ejaculation. The dream was extremely clear in his mind. He got up, put on his robe, and went to the bathroom to shower. Looking at the clock, I saw that it was almost 3 in the morning. When he finished, he dried himself off, and as he left the bathroom, he noticed Melanie at her bedroom door. Walker, is everything okay? She asked. The night light behind her outlined her body through her thin pajamas. Yes, everything is fine. Just needed to freshen up. It's hard to sleep, he replied, unable to take his eyes off the outline of her full right breast. Her thighs and lower body were also clearly visible. She looked at him with a smile, then glanced down at herself, then back up at him. It was obvious that Melanie was well aware of how much he could see. Walker fought with all his might not to reach out to her, barely coping with this desire. Well, good night, he said, walking past his room. Good night, Melanie replied. There was slight disappointment in her voice. Life has returned to rhythm. Carla now often got up earlier than everyone else, prepared coffee, then breakfast. Melanie and Beth joined them for food. Now 2 women were bustling around in the house. It was almost like having 2 wives, except for the separate bedrooms. He suspected that there might be tension between them, but there was no sign of it at all. Since Melanie and Carla got along well, Walker began to think about returning to work. And then one afternoon, he walked into the house and saw Carla deftly typing on the computer, her hands flying across the keyboard at the same speed he had seen before her stroke. She raised her head and noticed his surprised look. It's like, I start doing something, and suddenly it flashes in my head exactly how it's done. She smiled at him. Walker just nodded, pleased. He went to check on Beth, who was playing in the living room. She sat at the table, writing in large letters. Now she is 7 years old, and she already reads and writes well. Melanie walked up to him as he stood watching. Without thinking, Walker instinctively put his arm around her waist. Melanie looked at him in surprise, then leaned over and kissed him. It was only a light kiss, but he felt dizzy when their lips touched. Without thinking, he kissed her again, much deeper this time. He looked at her face, tears sparkled in the corners of her eyes, and she abruptly let him go. Walker stood there, trying to comprehend what had just happened, while she quickly disappeared into her bedroom. He walked into the living room, turned on the TV, and sat for a long time, not noticing what was on the screen. A few days later, Walker was surprised to see Sarah and Tim drive up to the house. He walked out onto the porch to greet them. "Hello, guys," he called as they walked up the path. "We have news, Dad," Tim said. "Let's go into the house and sit down, okay?" he added. Okay, Walker understood from Tim's tone that he was talking about something important. They went inside and gathered at the kitchen table. Melanie, realizing that the matter was serious, hurried away. "That Jonathan, he had only a couple of months left before his release?" Walker nodded. It didn't bother him that much, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered it. "So, this won't happen." "He's dead," Tim said evenly. "Dead? Is it true? What's happened?" Walker hasn't thought about him much in the last couple of years, given all the problems in his life. He had a conflict and insulted some bad people. A fight ensued, and one of them had a knife. "I see," Walker said. He didn't feel anything. This part of his life was over. "One more thing," Tim added. Sarah beamed, and Walker immediately guessed. "You'll become a grandfather," Tim smiled. Walker felt like he was about to do somersaults with joy. He then proceeded to lecture Tim about how Sarah should rub cocoa butter every night to prevent stretch marks. Sarah burst into laughter when he announced that he wanted to be present at the birth of his grandson. "God, Dad, relax. There are still almost 7 months left," she said as he hugged her tightly. Carla and Melanie came in just at that moment, and everything had to be repeated again. "Great. Now I'm really happy," Carla said, hugging Sarah. Then came everyone's hugs. As Melanie hugged Walker, he noticed that Carla was watching with a strange expression on her face. Glancing at Sarah, he saw exactly the same expression on her face. He blushed slightly and released Melanie. That night, as Walker lay in bed, his head filled with thoughts, he suddenly heard a soft knock on the door. "Can I come in?" Carla's voice rang out. Of course, what happened? He sat down, thinking that she needed help. The door opened, and for a moment Carla's silhouette was outlined in the dim light of the corridor. It was clear that she was wearing nothing under her short nightgown. She walked over and sat on the edge of the bed and just sat there for a few moments, not saying anything. "Walker, I want." Her hand slid over his bare chest, then down his stomach. Then she pulled back the light blanket and slid into bed next to him. Walker understood everything. He tried his best to empty his mind, but he couldn't. She pressed her lips to his chest, slid her hand down, and began to caress him. No reaction. "Carla, no, I can't." The same image flashed through Walker's head again, her doing the same thing to Jonathan. His stomach clenched, and a feeling of nausea came over him. He grabbed her hand and pushed her away. "I just can't," he said bitterly. Stubbornly, she reached for him again. "Let me, please," she whispered, continuing her attempts. Her skillful hands began to work, and this time Walker gave in, trying his best to turn off his thoughts. Even so, he only managed to get half aroused. Carla didn't stop until Walker finally felt a faint pleasure. Carla sat up and looked at him. He could barely see her face. He thought he saw tears sparkle in her eyes, but he couldn't be sure. "Oh, Walker, I'm so sorry," she whispered, then stood up and quickly left. For some more time, he listened to the monitor in her room, heard her quietly sobbing, and then silence. He realized that she had turned it off. "I want to talk to you," Carla said just a few days later. "Okay," Walker internally prepared for this. They sat down at the kitchen table. At first, Carla looked down, then raised her head and looked him straight in the eyes. "Now I can take care of myself. I'm fine," she said, uncertainty. "Yes, I'm glad to see it," Walker replied. "You don't love me anymore, do you? You don't even try to touch me." "Carla, I just can't," he admitted. "You'll never want me again, right?" she asked sadly, looking down again. "No, probably not like before," he admitted. "Then I can't stay. I want to go to Sarah," she said firmly. "What? Carla, I love you, but you don't love me. I know. It will be better this way. I spoke to Sarah and Tim. They have a place, and they said I could live with them. I will help with a child. Sarah wants to work, wants to be someone. You know you can stay here. I will take care of you. No, it's time to move on. You need your life back." "And so do I," she said. There was determination in her gaze. "Fine, if that's what you want," Walker sighed. "Yes, I want to. You can move on with your life. Maybe with Melanie?" Carla grinned. "Melanie? There is nothing between us. I know. You're just a fool. She loves you. That's why I tried. I wanted to bring you back, even if it was just a part of you, but—" Carla suddenly laughed. Walker didn't know what to say. "It's my fault. If I could turn back time. But I can't. It will be better this way. I'm leaving Walker, okay?" Tears sparkled in her eyes. Walker stood up and hugged her, not letting go for a long time. "Okay," he finally said. "But I still love you, Walker. And I'm really sorry," she whispered. Walker leaned in and kissed her for the first time in a very long time. He understood that she was right. This stage of his life was over. But deep down, he doubted that Melanie was really interested in him, for real. Maybe sexually, yes, he thought about it. But for how long? How's the couple? And that was exactly what was important to him. He was not interested in promiscuous relationships. He didn't know what to say or how to say it. "That's why I didn't say anything." "I guess you don't need me anymore?" Melanie asked as she and Walker finished packing the last box of Carla's things. Sarah had been helping them all morning, carrying boxes out to the large van she had rented. She had just returned to the house and overheard this conversation. "I don't know what will happen next, but you can stay here until—" Walker began. "Dad, what a dumbass you are. Tell her already," Sarah suddenly blurted out. Walker simply looked at her. "For God's sake, Dad, Melanie is in love with you. Isn't that right, Melanie?" Melanie blushed deeply and stood up. Walker turned to her and looked straight into her eyes. Then he smiled. Melanie rushed into his arms. "I'm still married. I need to sort this out." He began, but his words were muffled by her kiss. "Dad, you and Mom haven't really been together for almost 3 years. It's time for you to be happy again. Mom will be fine with us, and I want her to live with us," Sarah said with a smile. At that moment, Tim entered the room. He stopped and looked around, trying to understand what was happening. When I realized it, I smiled too. "I had to push Daddy a little, honey," Sarah laughed. Looking at Walker, who was kissing Melanie again, Sarah grinned. "Let's leave before they completely confuse us," she said, grabbing her husband's hand and leading him out the door. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.